1942 North Atlantic, the sea was a vast black mirror, silent but for the churn of diesel engines beneath its surface. Commander Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock stood inside the dimly lit control room of U-96, the red glow of the gauges casting ghostly reflections across tired faces. Outside, the Atlantic was merciless, freezing, endless, alive with death. For months, his U-boat and others like it had ruled these waters. The Germans called it die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. Convoys burned in the night as wolfpacks tore through Allied shipping lanes with mechanical precision. Each torpedo strike was another victory for the Kriegsmarine, another line in the diary of Hitler's invisible arm at sea. The men believed themselves untouchable, hunters cloaked by darkness, shielded by the vastness of the ocean. But that illusion was beginning to crack. Reports whispered through encrypted channels told of convoys that turned toward approaching U-boats before they were even sighted. Destroyers that dropped depth charges with uncanny accuracy as if guided by unseen eyes. The commander dismissed it as luck, coincidence, or intelligence leaks. The idea that the enemy could somehow see through the night was unthinkable. Yet unease crept in. Even the veterans, men hardened by years of war, began glancing at the sonar operator's screen with nervous suspicion, as though the machine itself were haunted. One moonless night, as the U-96 surfaced to recharge its batteries, a strange hum pulsed through the ether, faint but distinct, like static wrapped in purpose. Moments later, the horizon erupted. Searchlights sliced through the Black Sea, locking onto the submarine's position as if guided by some supernatural hand. Explosions thundered around them, geysers of seawater slamming against the hull. The crew scrambled to dive, panic surging through the cramped steel coffee, in as the commander barked orders drowned by chaos. When silence finally returned, the men stared at one another, pale and trembling. Something impossible had happened. That night, deep beneath the Atlantic, Lehmann-Willenbrock wrote in his logbook, "They knew where we were, before we struck, before we surfaced, before the ocean even moved." He did not yet know it, but this was the moment the tide of the Atlantic War began to turn. The hunters of the deep had become the hunted, and an invisible technology, born in British laboratories, had just changed everything. In the early days of the U-boat campaign, the German Navy believed it had engineered a perfect weapon of terror. The Atlantic was their domain, vast, dark, and unforgiving. U-boats struck unseen, surfacing under the cloak of night to unleash torpedoes that carved fiery wounds across Allied convoys. Ships vanished beneath the waves in minutes, and with them, thousands of tons of vital supplies destined for Britain's survival. Every successful patrol was celebrated in Berlin. Propaganda posters declared the U-boat men as the knights of the deep. They were young, fearless, and believed themselves invisible. The tactics were simple, yet devastating. A lone submarine would shadow a convoy, radioing its position to nearby wolfpacks. Under cover of darkness, they would swarm, striking from multiple directions before vanishing into the deep. Convoy escorts, old destroyers and corvettes, were often powerless, unable to locate their attackers once the torpedoes hit. It was a war fought by sound and instinct, and in those early months, the Germans had mastered both. For every Allied innovation, the U-boats adapted faster. Their sonar decoys, called Pillenwerfer, mimicked propeller noise, confusing the enemy's underwater listening devices. But in late 1941, subtle anomalies began to appear in patrol reports. Convoys that should have been easy prey suddenly changed course mid-ocean, evading traps before they were sprung. Some ships began sailing in tighter formations, with escorts moving in calculated arcs that perfectly intersected known U-boat attack routes. At first, the German High Command suspected spies, that perhaps Enigma transmissions had been compromised, but the codes held firm. The British seemed to know something the Germans didn't. For commanders like Lehmann-Willenbrock, the change was almost imperceptible at first. A destroyer appearing on the horizon soon. Earlier than expected, a convoy turning toward them before periscope contact. A sudden barrage of depth charges from an unseen enemy. Each incident was dismissed as bad luck or clever tactics. Yet with every mission, the coincidences multiplied. A sense of unease spread through the ranks, though no one dared say it aloud. The Atlantic, once a silent ally, now felt like it was listening, as if the darkness itself had betrayed them. What no one aboard the U-boats yet understood was that an invisible revolution was underway. Somewhere in Britain's laboratories and radar stations, the unseen had become visible, and the ocean's hunters were now being tracked, not by spies or chance, but by science itself. By the winter of 1942, British scientists and engineers had achieved what many in the German Navy believed impossible: the power to detect submarines without sight, sound, or signal. It began quietly in the laboratories of the Telecommunications Research Establishment, where radar pioneers like Sir Robert Watson Watt and Edward Bowen had already proven the sky could be scanned for enemy bombers. But now, their attention turned to the sea. The result was an innovation so subtle and transformative that it would remain one of the war's best-kept secrets: centimetric radar, operating on microwave frequencies that could detect even the smallest periscope slicing through the waves. The device, compact and astonishingly precise, could be fitted onto aircraft and ships. For the first time, Allied patrols could scan the dark Atlantic in real time, locating U-boats even when they ran surfaced at night, the very tactic that had once guaranteed their survival. The magnetron, a small cylindrical metal tube, was the heart of this transformation. It emitted microwaves capable of painting ghostly images of objects invisible to the naked eye. To the U-boat crews, it would appear as if the Allies could sense them in total darkness. But the Germans didn't yet know the source of this uncanny awareness. Their engineers, brilliant but misguided, searched in the wrong direction. They suspected improved sonar, or perhaps aircraft equipped with new forms of infrared detection. None imagined that the enemy had harnessed the invisible spectrum of radio waves to turn the ocean into a hunting ground. The result was catastrophic. Within weeks, U-boats began disappearing without distress calls, vanishing into the black Atlantic, with all hands lost. Patrols that once returned victorious now ended in silence. Commanders wrote of eerie encounters, Allied bombers appearing suddenly through fog, dropping depth charges with precision that defied reason. Survivors described hearing aircraft engines just seconds before impact, the explosions tearing through the hull before they could even dive. One U-boat officer called it as if the British had eyes in the storm. In Berlin, Admiral Dönitz grew increasingly concerned. His once invincible wolfpacks were bleeding out in the mid-Atlantic. Something had shifted in the invisible war. The technology he had dismissed as theoretical had become the Allies' deadliest weapon. And deep below the waves, men like Lehmann-Willenbrock began to feel a creeping dread, that they were no longer the hunters of the deep, but prey being watched by unseen eyes. By early 1943, the Atlantic was no longer the domain of the U-boats. The same waters that once offered concealment had turned into a graveyard. Convoys sailed under constant protection, their escorts now equipped with the mysterious new radar sets. Long-range aircraft, from Liberators to Wellingtons, scoured the sea with a gaze that pierced the night and fog alike. The Germans had no defense against what they could not see. What once felt like luck or coincidence had evolved into an unmistakable pattern. The Allies were finding them faster, attacking with precision, and leaving no trace behind. Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock and his crew began noticing the shift in subtle, chilling ways. When surfacing to recharge batteries, they could no longer linger on the open water. Within minutes, the distant drone of engines would echo overhead, an omen of death from above. The commander ordered shorter surface intervals, fewer transmissions, tighter silence. Yet even these precautions offered no safety. Destroyers began appearing in places no patrol charts could explain. Flares ignited the night sky, depth charges rolled off decks like clockwork, and sonar pings, once the telltale sign of proximity, now came too late to matter. The men on board grew restless, superstitious. They spoke in whispers of ghost planes and haunted ships that could sense movement underwater. Some claimed the ocean itself had turned against them. Inside the steel hull, the air was thick with sweat and fear. Every vibration, every mechanical hum felt like a signal betraying their position. Sleep came in short bursts, haunted by the echo of bombs thundering through water. Even the most hardened veterans, men who had survived dozens of missions, began to lose faith. Back in Germany, Dönitz demanded answers. His analysts pored over patrol data, looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that could explain the slaughter. It was then that faint traces began to appear. Intercepted Allied transmissions referencing something called ASV Mach 3. It was a clue, buried in code, but it hinted at something revolutionary. Some believed it was a new radar model. Others dismissed it as deception. Yet for those who studied the sea war closely, a terrifying realization began to take shape. The Allies were not guessing. They were seeing. Somewhere above the clouds, invisible waves were mapping the ocean's surface, turning stealth into vulnerability. The ocean, once the U-boat's perfect ally, had become transparent. The age of the hidden hunter was ending. In March 1943, as the U-boat fleet fought desperately to reclaim its fading dominance, the truth began to surface. Reports from returning submarines were grim and eerily similar. Aircraft appearing out of nowhere, destroyers attacking in total darkness, convoys changing course before contact. Lehmann-Willenbrock, once calm and analytical, now filled his logbook with uncertainty. His precise handwriting grew erratic, marked with short, terse entries. Detected again. No explanation. Aircraft attack at 02 Tero, impossible range. He began to suspect what few dared to believe, that something unseen, something beyond human sense, was watching them from the skies. The Allies had unleashed a new predator, the radar-equipped patrol bomber. Aircraft now carried a small device called the Leigh Light, which worked in tandem with radar. Once the radar detected a surfaced submarine, the aircraft would close in silently under cover of darkness. At the last moment, a blinding searchlight would snap on, freezing the U-boat in its beam, a floating silhouette framed for destruction. By the time the crew reached their diving stations, depth charges were already in the water. It was execution disguised as warfare. On the night of March 6th, U-96 surfaced north of the Azores, preparing to send a routine contact report. The radio operator tuned the transmitter, unaware that the signal itself betrayed their position. Within minutes, the radar of a British Wellington bomber locked on. From 5,000 feet above, the pilot saw a faint reflection, a tiny dot against the vast sea, and began his descent. The radar operator counted down the distance until the Leigh Light pierced the darkness, exposing the submarine's slick hull in a cone of blinding white. Panic erupted aboard U-96. Orders collided with screams. Hands fumbled at valves and levers as the commander shouted to dive. The bomber dropped its payload, 6 depth charges, that exploded in perfect sequence along the U-boat's path. The lights flickered, metal screamed, and seawater gushed through ruptured seams. Somehow, the submarine survived, limping away into the depths, but something in the crew had broken. In that moment, Lehmann-Willenbrock knew with absolute clarity that the age of stealth was over. The hunters of the deep had lost their invisibility. What radar had stolen was not merely the advantage. It was the very essence of U-boat warfare, the illusion of control. And as the commander stared into the flickering light of his control room, he understood the unbearable truth. The sea no longer hid them. It exposed them. By mid-1943, the invisible war in the Atlantic had become a massacre. The very tactics that had once brought Germany supremacy were now leading its men into traps. Allied radar blanketed the ocean, turning every dark wave into a map of reflections. Aircraft hunted day and night, their operators scanning glowing green screens for the faint pulse of a submarine's periscope or conning tower. Above them, the once dreaded wolfpacks were reduced to scattered remnants, isolated, hunted, and confused. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of Germany's U-boat strategy, was forced to confront the unthinkable. His greatest weapon had become a liability. His crews were dying faster than replacements could be trained. Between March and May of 1943, more than 40 U-boats were lost, a third of his active fleet. Dönitz demanded answers from his engineers. The Kriegsmarine's research division scrambled to develop countermeasures, experimenting with radar detectors such as the Metox receiver, a crude device that could sense enemy radar emissions. For a brief moment, it restored a flicker of hope. Crews believed they could now detect the unseen before it detected them. But that illusion, too, was shattered. The Allies had already upgraded to higher-frequency centimetric radar, undetectable by the Metox. The Germans didn't realize that their own detector emitted a faint signal of its own, one that Allied aircraft could trace. The hunters were unknowingly broadcasting their position every time they tried to hide. Each attempt to survive only made them more visible. It was a cruel paradox, and it left the men of the U-boats trapped between technology and death. Lehmann-Willenbrock experienced this firsthand. During a patrol west of Ireland, his Metox receiver crackled suddenly to life, a ghostly hum in the headphones. He ordered a crash dive, believing they'd escaped detection. Nuts later, the sea above them erupted. Depth charges exploded in symmetrical patterns, shaking the submarine like a child's toy. When they surfaced hours later, the crew was silent, hollow-eyed, drenched in sweat. The commander's faith in his instruments had been obliterated. In his logbook, he wrote a single line: "We listen for ghosts, and the ghosts listen back." The radar war had become more than a battle of machines. It was psychological disintegration. The Atlantic, once a theater of courage and precision, was now a silent abyss of paranoia. Every signal, every sound, every flicker of static carried the same unspoken message: the enemy is already watching. In the corridors of German Naval Command, disbelief turned to desperation. Reports from the Atlantic painted a grim picture: patrols that vanished without trace, convoys crossing untouched, and crews returning home shattered by fear more than by wounds. The mighty U-boat arm, once Germany's pride, was being strangled by an invisible hand. Dönitz, loyal to his men and still convinced of their importance to the Reich's survival, turned to his scientists with a final demand: to reclaim the sea through counter-radar innovation. But time was no longer an ally. In the laboratories at Kiel and Lorient, engineers worked feverishly, dissecting captured Allied equipment and experimenting with new defensive devices. They developed the Naxos radar detector, capable of sensing the British centimetric frequencies, and the Borkum jammer designed to disrupt radar signals. Yet even these innovations came too late. By the time Naxos reached operational boats, the Allies had already advanced again, integrating radar with new airborne search patterns and ultra-long-range patrols. The technological race had become an avalanche, and Germany was trapped beneath it. For the men beneath the waves, the psychological toll was unbearable. The once proud U-boat crews, celebrated in propaganda as invincible knights of the deep, now lived in constant terror. Every surfacing was a roll of dice against an enemy they could not see. Every signal they sent might summon death from the sky. The younger recruits, barely trained boys of 19 and 20, began to break down under the pressure. Some wept quietly at their stations, others whispered prayers into the engine noise. Discipline held, but faith had crumbled. Lehmann-Willenbrock, older now, and hollowed by sleepless nights, recorded his thoughts with a calm that bordered on resignation. "The sea is no longer our friend," he wrote. "It reveals our secrets, carries our echoes, betrays our silence." His words captured the mood of an entire fleet. In the beginning, they had believed in technology as their salvation. The periscope, the enigma, the torpedo, all tools of precision and mastery. But now, the Allies' machines had surpassed them. Their instruments had become instruments of doom. By the summer of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic, once balanced on a knife's edge, was effectively lost. Radar, the invisible eye of modern war, had rewritten the laws of combat. What the Germans could not see had destroyed them. The ocean that once protected their secrets had become their tomb. By the autumn of 1943, the rhythm of war at sea had changed forever. The Allies no longer feared the wolfpacks. They hunted them methodically, like predators that had learned every move of their prey. Radar-equipped aircraft flew in relentless patrols from Iceland, Newfoundland, and Gibraltar, sweeping the mid-Atlantic gap that had once been the U-boat's sanctuary. Ships now sailed in convoys so vast and coordinated that even the boldest German commander dared not attack. The invisible advantage had shifted completely, and the U-boat fleet was dying faster than it could be rebuilt. Inside the claustrophobic hulls of the surviving submarines, morale decayed into fatalism. The younger sailors spoke less, their movements mechanical, their faces pale under the red lamps. The thrum of the engines and the constant creak of pressure had become a background hymn to dread. They no longer spoke of victory, only survival. Every mission began with the unspoken knowledge that few would return. In those suffocating depths, fear became ritual. Men avoided eye contact when the hydrophone operator went silent, waiting for the faint hum that meant an aircraft was above them. When the first depth charge exploded, they would murmur together like monks at prayer, bracing for the second and third that always followed. The commanders, too, bore the mark of the change. Lehmann-Willenbrock's once confident posture had turned rigid, his face expressionless as he stared through the periscope into an ocean that had become alien. Each time he surfaced, he felt the weight of the unseen. The thought that radar beams were already crossing the waves, painting the outline of his boat in invisible light. He began to measure success not in victories, but in hours of survival. His logbooks, once filled with detailed attack diagrams, now contained only sparse entries. No contact, diving, constant interference, cannot transmit. The U-boats that once struck terror into the Allies had become phantoms themselves, shadows drifting beneath the waves, hiding not from enemy guns but from the very air above them. In the war rooms of London, analysts marked the progress with quiet satisfaction. The data told a brutal story. For every 10 submarines sent to sea, 6 would never return. The hunters had been consumed by their own domain. By December, the sea was filled with silence. The great Atlantic, which had echoed for years with the thunder of torpedoes and explosions, now lay heavy and still. But beneath that silence was tragedy. Thousands of men entombed in steel coffins, victims not of fate, but of a technology they never truly understood. In the ruins of occupied France, as German bases at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and La Rochelle came under constant Allied bombardment, the once proud U-boat arm withdrew into its bunkers, massive fortresses of reinforced concrete meant to defy the bombs. Inside, the air was thick with oil fumes and despair. Crews prepared for patrols they knew would be their last, while the thunder of distant explosions vibrated through the walls like the heartbeat of a dying empire. The Kriegsmarine's slogans about honor and sacrifice had lost their power. The men no longer dreamed of victory. They only hoped for a death swift enough to escape the terror of the hunt. Admiral Dönitz, still loyal to the Führer and to the myth of the U-boat's invincibility, issued new orders. Continue the offensive at any cost. But those costs were unsustainable. The Allies' radar network now stretched across oceans. Long-range B-24 Liberators could patrol for 16 hours, equipped with the latest ASV radar, homing beacons, and magnetic anomaly detectors that sensed even subtle disruptions in the Earth's field caused by submarines below. There was no darkness deep enough to hide in, no silence safe enough to survive. Lehmann-Willenbrock's final missions reflected this grim reality. His crew slept in their uniforms, too exhausted to remove them between alarms. The metallic tang of fear mixed with the stench of diesel and sweat. Each surfacing became an act of courage and defiance. The commander often stood alone on the bridge, peering into fog and rain, watching for a flicker of light, the telltale glint that meant the enemy had already found them. He no longer trusted his instruments. Even silence seemed deceitful. Every sound, every vibration could be death approaching. In one of his last entries he wrote, "The sea has turned against us. We are surrounded not by water but by signals, unseen, unheard yet everywhere." His words carried the haunted resignation of a man who had glimpsed the future of warfare and understood that his kind would not survive it. The ocean that had once promised endless freedom now felt like a cage made of echoes. As the year ended, the once invincible submarine fleet was broken. The wolfpacks that had terrorized the Atlantic for years were scattered, their bones resting at the bottom of the sea. The invisible war had revealed its victor, not courage or numbers, but technology. Radar had stripped away the myth of the deep and exposed the truth. Invisibility was no longer human. It belonged to the machines. By 1944, the U-boat war had devolved into quiet tragedy. What had begun as a campaign of dominance had become a slow execution, carried out by waves, wind, and invisible light. The Allied radar network, refined, coordinated, and merciless, covered every ocean corridor from Newfoundland to Gibraltar. Submarines no longer prowled the Atlantic as predators. They crawled through it like ghosts, trying to avoid detection from an enemy that seemed omniscient. Every journey to sea was a march toward annihilation. In British intelligence circles, the system worked with terrifying precision. Coastal Command's aircraft operated under a seamless fusion of radar, sonar, and ultra-intercepts. The Germans never realized that Enigma's codes had been broken, that every transmission Dönitz sent to his fleet was quietly copied and read in Bletchley Park. When the Allies knew where a wolfpack was heading, radar-equipped aircraft simply waited for them to surface. The war beneath the waves had become one-sided, guided not by instinct or bravery, but by data. For men like Lehmann-Willenbrock, the change was soul-crushing. Once he had been a hunter, his instincts sharp, his purpose clear. Now he commanded a crew living in constant dread of the unseen. Each time the radar detector gave a faint hum, his heart clenched, knowing it meant they were already being watched. The sea's comforting rhythm, the hum of the diesels, the hiss of compressed air, had become unbearable, each sound a potential betrayal. The men had begun to move slower, speak less. Fear had replaced discipline. Fatalism replaced hope. During one patrol, west of the Bay of Biscay, Lehmann-Willenbrock surfaced briefly under a moonless sky to receive transmission orders. The wind was calm, the sea black and glassy. For the first time in days, it seemed peaceful. Then a white flare burst overhead, brilliant and blinding. The shriek of an aircraft engine cut through the night, followed by explosions that shattered the calm. Depth charges rained down in symmetrical bursts, metal twisted, lights failed, and the crew was thrown from their stations. When it was over, U-96 drifted in silence, bleeding air and oil. Miraculously, she survived again. But the men did not cheer. Survival no longer felt like victory. It felt like postponement. That night, the commander wrote nothing in his logbook. He simply sat in the control room, listening to the water pressing against the hull, realizing that the war he had once mastered was no longer his to fight. The machines had taken over, and there was no strategy left, only endurance. As 1944 turned to 1945, the U-boat fleet was a shadow of its former self. What had once been Germany's deadliest weapon now existed only as rumor and memory, a ghost fleet scattered across the Atlantic, stalked by the same unseen power that had destroyed its confidence. The great submarine pens of France were either abandoned or bombed into ruin. The surviving boats operated from Norway and the Baltic, far from the open ocean, reduced to training missions and desperate final sorties ordered by men who refused to admit defeat. Admiral Dönitz still clung to faith in innovation. His engineers unveiled the Type 21, the so-called electroboot, a revolutionary design capable of long submerged runs and higher underwater speeds. It was sleek, silent, and years ahead of its time. On paper, it could have reversed the war beneath the waves, but reality was cruel. Allied bombings crippled Germany's shipyards. Components arrived late, incomplete, or damaged. Only a handful of these boats were ever completed before the war's end, too late to change the outcome. The dream of an invincible U-boat fleet had died long before the Third Reich collapsed. For the men who had lived through the radar revolution, the memory of what had happened haunted them for the rest of their lives. Lehmann-Willenbrock, one of the few commanders to survive multiple patrols, returned to a Germany that no longer recognized its heroes. The medals and ceremonies meant nothing beside the names of thousands lost at sea, young faces who had believed in stealth, in mastery of the ocean, in the myth of invisibility. He spent his post-war years in silence, rarely speaking of what he had seen, except to remark, "It was not the sea that betrayed us. It was progress." Across the Atlantic, Allied scientists dismantled and studied the wreckage of the U-boat fleet. In radar laboratories from London to Washington, engineers catalogued every captured device, tracing the evolution of German countermeasures that had come too late. The war at sea had proven a brutal lesson. That victory no longer depended solely on courage or command, but on invisible wavelengths, mathematics, and machines. The once mystical struggle of man against the ocean had transformed into something colder, sharper, and inescapably modern. The Atlantic itself bore silent witness. Beneath its surface, thousands of steel coffins lay rusting in the dark, forming a vast underwater cemetery that stretched from the Irish coast to the Caribbean. Each wreck was a reminder of how quickly dominance can vanish, how the hunters of one generation can become relics of the next. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Atlantic remained restless, its waves concealing the bones of a generation. Nearly 30,000 German submariners had vanished into its depths, more than three-quarters of the entire U-boat force. It was the highest mortality rate of any branch in any military during the war. Their steel coffins rested in silence, scattered across the sea lanes they once ruled. To the world above, the radar victory was celebrated as a triumph of science and strategy. But to those who had lived beneath those waves, it marked something darker. The end of an era when man believed courage could outwit technology. In the months that followed, Allied intelligence pored over captured documents, diaries, and encrypted logs. Among them were the notebooks of commanders like Lehmann-Willenbrock, fragments of a dying struggle. His final entries spoke not of enemies or orders, but of the feeling that the ocean itself had changed. It no longer hides us. It listens. It speaks in pulses we cannot hear. He had grasped, long before historians or scientists, the terrifying truth of modern warfare, that the battlefield had moved beyond flesh and metal into the invisible realm of energy and information. The war beneath the waves had been more than a clash of navies. It was the birth of electronic warfare. Radar, sonar, code-breaking, these invisible weapons defined the outcome long before the last torpedo was fired. The men who fought with courage and instinct were suddenly rendered obsolete by mathematics and magnetrons. The hunter's art had been dismantled by equations, and though the Allies had won the physical war, something profound had been lost. The illusion that bravery alone could master chaos. Years later, when the sea calmed and the wrecks became reefs, divers who found the remains of U-boats reported an eerie stillness. The Paris copes were frozen mid-turn, the controls locked in final gestures, coffee cups still resting beside the gauges. The ocean had preserved them in the moment of realization, when they understood the future had arrived, and they were no longer part of it. The story of the U-boat aces did not end in defeat. It ended in revelation. The invisible eyes that once hunted them would go on to shape every war that followed, from the skies of Korea to the jungles of Vietnam, and beyond into the digital age. In those silent, rusting hulls beneath the Atlantic, the modern world was born,